London, 1815. The Hartwell ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and illuminating the cream and gold decor as the elite of society whirled across polished floors in a kaleidoscope of silks and jewels. Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood alone near a marble column, her slender figure draped in modest blue silk that complemented her auburn hair, which was swept into an elegant chignon, adorned with a single pearl clip. At 26, she had long since accepted her place as a wallflower, more interested in literature and intellectual pursuits than the marriage mart. She absently fingered the small volume of poetry hidden in her reticule as she observed the dancers with a detached anthropological interest, until fragments of hushed conversation from nearby matrons pierced her contemplative bubble. "Poor creature, to be promised to that cold-hearted devil," whispered Lady Pembroke behind her fan to the Countess of Shelton. "The Westmoreland curse will claim another victim." Eleanor froze, her spine stiffening as she strained to hear more. Has she been told yet? That her father has sold her to the Duke to cover his gambling debts? Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the whispers confirmed the vague unease that had plagued her since her father began acting strangely the previous week. Later that night, with rain lashing against the windows of their once grand townhouse, Eleanor confronted her father in his study. The Earl of Blackwood sat slumped at his desk, the glow from a single oil lamp casting deep shadows across his haggard face, making him appear far older than his 55 years. "My dear," he began when she demanded the truth, his voice breaking as his hands trembled on the worn leather desktop. "The debts were insurmountable. The Duke approached with an offer I could not refuse. His wealth is our salvation." Eleanor stood perfectly still, watching raindrops trace jagged paths down the window pane, a strange calm settling over her as she processed this betrayal. The reflection that gazed back at her from the darkened glass was transformed, her usual soft expression replaced by one of steely determination. "So I am to be sold like chattel to a man known for his cruelty," she stated flatly, her voice devoid of the hysteria her father had clearly expected. "Very well. If I must marry the Duke of Westmoreland, then marry him I shall. But father," she added, turning to face him with eyes that had hardened like amber in sunlight, "do not expect me to play the cowering bride. If he is truly as cold and heartless as they say, he will find I am not so easily broken." The Earl looked up at his daughter with a mixture of shame and wonder, seeing for the first time not the bookish girl he had largely ignored, but a woman with an inner strength he had never noticed before. "Eleanor, forgive me," he whispered. "I had no choice." She nodded once. Sharply. "We rarely do, father. We rarely do." The Duke of Westmoreland's London residence stood imposing against the darkening sky, its Georgian façade of Portland stone appearing almost menacing in the gathering storm clouds. Inside the cavernous study, Sebastian Grenville, 32nd Duke of Westmoreland, regarded his solicitor with naked contempt, his tall frame silhouetted against the massive windows that overlooked his manicured gardens. At 32, the Duke cut an impressive figure, his broad shoulders draped in a perfectly tailored coat of midnight blue, his raven hair swept back from a face that might have been considered handsome were it not for the permanent sneer that twisted his lips and the jagged scar that ran along his jaw, a souvenir from a duel he refused to discuss. "So Lord Blackwood has finally sold his daughter to settle his debts," he said mockingly, his deep voice filling the opulent yet cold room with its mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books that had never been opened, crystal decanters catching the firelight, and heavy velvet curtains that seemed to absorb any warmth that might have existed in the space. How utterly predictable. "Mr. Harrison," the solicitor cleared his throat nervously as he clutched his portfolio of papers, the contracts already drawn up and awaiting the Duke's signature. The lady in question is of good family, Your Grace. Lady Eleanor Blackwood is accomplished, well-educated, and by all accounts possessed of a fine character. Sebastian moved to the sideboard with fluid grace despite his imposing height, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy without offering any to his visitor. Her character is irrelevant, he replied, his penetrating grey eyes cold as winter frost. The Blackwoods need my money, and society expects me to produce an heir. It is a simple transaction, nothing more. He drained half the glass in a single swallow, the amber liquid burning a path down his throat that did nothing to thaw the icy core of resentment that had lodged in his chest since childhood. I watched my mother wither away in an arranged marriage to my father, he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr that made the solicitor shift uncomfortably. I witnessed firsthand what happens when a gentle woman is bound to a cruel man. This union will be in name only, Mr. Harrison. Lady Eleanor will have her title, her pin money, and complete freedom to do as she pleases, so long as she does not interfere with my affairs or expect anything resembling affection from me. Outside, thunder rolled across the London sky, a low, rumbling warning of the storm to come. Sebastian moved to the window, watching as the first heavy raindrops began to splatter against the glass. He thought of the woman who would soon bear his name, another innocent, sacrificed on the altar of aristocratic necessity. Let her father explain the kind of man she is to marry, he thought bitterly. Let her come prepared for disappointment. The solicitor, sensing dismissal, gathered his papers and backed toward the door. The contracts will be ready for signing at the end of the week, Your Grace. The marriage can take place as soon as the banns are read. Sebastian did not turn from the window, merely lifting his glass in mocking salute. To matrimony, Mr. Harrison. May Lady Eleanor Blackwood enjoy her purchased title, for she will certainly not enjoy its owner. The Blackwood drawing-room, once elegant, now bore the unmistakable signs of genteel poverty that no amount of careful arrangement could disguise. Faded silk damask clung to chairs whose springs had long since surrendered to time and use, while dusty sunbeams illuminated worn patches on the Aubusson carpet where generations of Blackwoods had paced. Eleanor stood near the marble fireplace, her posture perfect despite her inner turmoil, wearing her best afternoon dress of sage green that had been carefully altered to align with current fashions. She had been waiting for over an hour, a deliberate slight that had caused her father to check his pocket watch repeatedly with growing anxiety. When the Duke of Westmoreland finally arrived, his entrance was calculated to intimidate, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before he strode into the room with the confidence of a man who knew his worth down to the penny. Sebastian Grenville was dressed impeccably in a coat of superfine midnight blue, his cravat a masterpiece of complex folds, secured with a diamond pin worth more than the entire contents of the drawing-room. His cold grey eyes swept the space dismissively, before settling on Eleanor with an expression of bored disdain. "I see my future bride is at least presentable," he remarked, after barely glancing at her, his deep voice carrying an undercurrent of mockery that made the Earl of Blackwood wince visibly, far more so than I was led to believe. Eleanor felt a flash of indignation that burned through her nervousness like lightning through storm clouds. She had prepared herself for coldness, even cruelty, but the casual dismissal in his tone awoke something fierce within her. "And I see the rumors of your charm have been greatly exaggerated, Your Grace," she replied, meeting his gaze directly, her amber eyes steady despite her racing heart. The Earl made a strangled sound of horror at this breach of decorum, his face draining of colour as he stepped forward. "My daughter speaks in jest, of course, Your Grace. She is merely overcome by the honour of your presence." Sebastian turned his attention to Eleanor more fully, really looking at her for the first time. His eyebrow raised slightly, the first crack in his armour of indifference. The woman before him was not the simpering, cowed creature he had expected. There was intelligence in those remarkable amber eyes, and a surprising defiance in the lift of her chin. Most women wilted under his gaze, yet Lady Eleanor Blackwood met it unflinchingly. "No need to apologize, Lord Blackwood," the Duke said slowly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. "I prefer honesty to flattery, no matter how crudely delivered." A muscle twitched in his scarred jaw, but something that might have been reluctant respect flickered briefly across his features. "Let us proceed with the formalities. I have a prior engagement at my club. The sooner we conclude our business, the better for all concerned." The word business hung in the air between them, reminding everyone present that this was a transaction, not a romance. Yet as they sat to discuss the marriage contract, Sebastian found his attention repeatedly drawn to the quiet dignity with which his future bride conducted herself, so at odds with the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. Perhaps this arrangement would not be entirely tedious after all. St. George's Church in Hanover Square stood resplendent, its ancient stones witness to centuries of aristocratic unions. Today, the hallowed space overflowed with London society, not out of genuine affection for the couple, but from morbid curiosity about this union between the notorious Duke of Westmoreland and the daughter of the financially ruined Earl of Blackwood. Sebastian Grenville stood rigid at the altar, his tall frame encased in formal black, his expression carved from stone as sunlight filtered through stained glass to cast colored shadows across his scarred face. The congregation rose as Eleanor appeared at the entrance, a vision in cream silk that skimmed her slender figure, her auburn hair adorned with orange blossoms and pearl pins beneath a veil of Belgian lace. She moved with measured grace, despite the whispers that followed her progress down the aisle like poisonous snakes. "Marrying for money, clearly," murmured the Countess of Sheffield to her companion. "Poor girl. Look at his face. No love there. He will break her spirit within a month," replied Lady Harrington, with ill-concealed relish at the prospect of witnessing another victim of the Westmoreland curse. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on Sebastian, refusing to acknowledge the whispers or the pitying glances. Her father, ashen-faced and trembling slightly, placed her hand on the prayer book, symbolically transferring her from his protection to her husband's, though none present believed the Duke would protect anything but his own interests. When the time came for their vows, Sebastian spoke with deliberate clarity, his deep voice echoing through the hushed church, mockingly emphasizing the words, "honor and cherish," with such exaggerated sincerity that titters rippled through the congregation. Several gentlemen exchanged knowing looks, while society matrons whispered behind gloved hands, amused by his blatant insincerity. Eleanor responded with quiet dignity, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of the humiliation that burned within her. She made her promises with simple sincerity that contrasted sharply with Sebastian's theatrical performance, causing several observers to note her composure with surprised respect. The Duke slipped a magnificent diamond ring onto her finger with practiced efficiency, touching her hand as briefly as possible, as if prolonged contact might contaminate him. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian offered his arm with cold formality, leading Eleanor back down the aisle through the sea of speculative gazes. His face remained impassive, giving no hint of his thoughts as they passed beneath the stone archway into the spring sunshine. Outside, as they waited for their carriage amid a flurry of half-hearted congratulations, Sebastian leaned close to Eleanor, his breath warm against her ear despite his glacial tone. "The performance is complete, Lady Westmoreland," he whispered, using her new title with subtle mockery. "Now we may begin our charade. We need only convince society of our contentment, not each other." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her amber eyes clear and unfathomable. "Then we shall give society a performance worthy of Drury Lane, your grace," she replied softly. "Though I warn you, I intend to play my role convincingly." Something flashed in Sebastian's eyes, too quickly to identify, before his customary mask of indifference returned. "The Duchess of Westmoreland," he mused coldly. "How utterly disappointing the reality must be compared to your girlish dreams." The journey to Westmoreland estate stretched across hours of misty countryside, the elegant travelling carriage cutting through swirling fog as rain clouds gathered overhead. Eleanor sat opposite her new husband, their knees occasionally brushing with the sway of the vehicle, each touch causing Sebastian to shift away as if burned. Neither spoke, the silence between them growing denser than the mist outside, broken only by the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional crack of the coachman's whip. Eleanor occupied herself with watching the landscape transition from London's outskirts to rolling hills and ancient forests, while Sebastian remained engrossed in papers from his dispatch box, pointedly ignoring her presence. As evening approached, the mist parted briefly to reveal their destination. Westmoreland House loomed against the darkening sky, a massive stone mansion of grey granite that resembled a medieval fortress more than a family home, its countless windows like watchful eyes, its towers and chimneys stark against the gathering storm clouds. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather as the carriage rolled through imposing iron gates and up a long gravel drive lined with ancient yew trees twisted into fantastical shapes. When they finally came to a stop before the grand entrance, footmen rushed forward with umbrellas as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The household staff awaited them in the cavernous entrance hall, lined up with military precision on either side of the black and white marble floor. Eleanor immediately noticed the stiffness in their postures, the downcast eyes, the tangible aura of fear that permeated the space whenever Sebastian addressed them. The Duke strode through the hall without acknowledging her, issuing curt orders about his luggage and demanding his steward attend him immediately in his study. Left standing alone, Eleanor was approached by an elderly woman in a black dress and starched white apron, her silver hair arranged beneath a modest cap, her kind face lined with years of service. "Mrs. Winters, your grace," the housekeeper introduced herself with a curtsy. "I hope your journey was not too fatiguing. If you will allow me, I shall show you to your chambers." The winding corridors and multiple staircases formed a labyrinth. Eleanor suspected she would struggle to navigate for weeks to come. Portraits of previous dukes and duchesses watched their progress with painted eyes that seemed to follow their movement. Generations of Grenvilles with the same aristocratic features and cold grey eyes as her new husband. When they finally reached a blue and silver suite in the east wing, Mrs. Winters hesitated, her wrinkled hands twisting nervously in her apron. "His Grace has arranged for you to have the Duchess suite," she explained with evident embarrassment. "It is far from his own chambers, I fear. His Grace was most specific in his orders, my lady." That night, unable to sleep in her unfamiliar bed despite its luxurious hangings, Eleanor donned her robe and ventured out with a candle to explore her new home. The vast, shadowy house creaked and whispered around her as she wandered through formal drawing rooms and portrait galleries, finally discovering a magnificent library whose shelves stretched 2 stories high, filled with thousands of volumes. Dust covered many of the tomes, suggesting neglect, but Eleanor ran her fingers reverently along leather spines, finding comfort in the presence of books when a sardonic voice cut through the silence. "Looking for escape already, Lady Westmoreland?" Sebastian stood in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the late hour, a glass of brandy in his hand. "There is none, I assure you. We are all prisoners here, in our own ways." The morning sun streamed through tall windows in the formal dining room, illuminating the massive oak table that could easily seat 30 but currently accommodated only 3. Sebastian sat at the head, immaculate in a tailored riding coat despite the early hour, while his cousin Lord Thomas Grenville occupied the place to his right, his foppish attire and carefully arranged golden curls contrasting sharply with the Duke's severe appearance. Eleanor entered precisely at 9, having taken care with her appearance despite a restless night. She wore a morning dress of deep blue that brightened her hazel eyes and complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Sebastian barely glanced up as she took her place at the opposite end of the table. But Lord Thomas rose with exaggerated gallantry. "Good morning, cousin," he greeted her with a flourishing bow that bordered on impertinence. "How delightful to see Westmoreland House graced with feminine beauty at last." Eleanor nodded politely, noting the calculated insincerity in his smile as servants silently placed dishes of eggs, ham, and fresh bread before them. Before she could respond, Sebastian cleared his throat, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Now that we are all present, I shall outline the arrangements for this marriage," he announced coldly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room despite its low volume. The servants paused in their duties, eyes downcast but ears attentive, as their master continued. "My wife will manage the household and fulfill the necessary social obligations expected of her position. We will appear together at public functions when required by propriety. Otherwise, we need not interact. I have my pursuits, and Lady Westmoreland is free to occupy herself as she wishes, provided she maintains the dignity of her title." Eleanor felt the weight of the servants watching for her reaction from beneath lowered lashes, their collective breath held as they awaited the response of their new mistress. Lord Thomas smirked openly, clearly anticipating her humiliation. Instead of the tears or anger they expected, Eleanor calmly buttered a piece of toast, her steady hands betraying none of the indignation burning within her. "As you wish, Your Grace," she replied, her voice carrying the same pleasant tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Though I wonder if your staff might prefer clear direction from just one of us regarding household matters. I would hate to issue instructions that contradict your own preferences." The servants exchanged quick glances as Sebastian slowly raised his gaze to meet hers, his jaw tightening at this subtle challenge to his authority delivered with such seemingly innocent concern. Lord Thomas looked between them with undisguised interest, his breakfast forgotten. "I am certain the staff understands the chain of command," Sebastian responded, each word clipped. "Mrs. Winters will provide you with the household accounts and introduce you to the relevant staff after breakfast. Any significant changes to established procedures will require my approval." "Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "I would expect nothing less, and perhaps you might provide me with a list of the local families I should call upon. As your wife, I naturally wish to represent Westmoreland with the dignity and respect its illustrious name deserves." Sebastian narrowed his eyes slightly, recognizing that her apparent compliance cleverly established her intentions to take her role seriously rather than fade into the background as he had clearly expected. "Your eagerness to embrace your duties is noted, Lady Westmoreland," he replied, the faintest hint of irritation coloring his tone. "I shall have my secretary prepare the necessary information. Now, if you will excuse me, estate business requires my attention." The transformation of Westmoreland House began gradually, like the first tender shoots of spring emerging after a harsh winter. Eleanor spent her first week taking inventory of the vast estate, meeting with staff from the dairymaids to the head gardener, listening more than speaking as she learned the rhythms of her new home. What she discovered was a household held captive by fear and rigid tradition, where innovation was discouraged and warmth had long since been banished from the grand rooms and endless corridors. With each passing day, Eleanor introduced small changes that rippled through the estate, like stones cast into still water. She instructed the housekeeper to open curtains that had remained drawn for years, allowing sunlight to flood rooms long kept in shadow. She replaced dark, heavy floral arrangements with simple, fresh bouquets gathered from the overgrown gardens. Most significantly, she treated the servants with consistent kindness paired with clear expectations, creating an atmosphere where efficiency stemmed from respect rather than terror. It was during a morning spent reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Winters that Eleanor first learned the truth about the previous Duke and Duchess. The elderly housekeeper hesitated when Eleanor inquired about the neglected rose garden visible from her bedroom window, the skeleton of what had clearly once been a beautiful space. "That was the late Duchess's pride and joy," Mrs. Winters explained, her wrinkled hands smoothing the account book nervously. She spent hours there in the early years of her marriage, when the house was filled with laughter and music. Then came the old Duke's affairs, his cruelty, the public humiliations. Each year, the garden received less attention as her spirit withered alongside the roses. The old Duke's cruelty broke his wife's spirit, and the young master's heart, she added in a whisper, glancing toward the door as if the mere mention of such matters might summon Sebastian's displeasure. Master Sebastian was devoted to his mother, you see. He would bring her flowers from the garden when she was too ill to visit it herself. After she passed, he ordered it abandoned just as it was. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Sebastian observed her activities from his study window, his quill forgotten in his hand, as he watched her directing gardeners in clearing the overgrown pathways of his mother's rose garden, her slender figure moving purposefully among the tangled bushes, occasionally kneeling despite her fine gown to examine a particular plant. His irritation at this invasion of sacred space battled with reluctant intrigue at her methodical approach and the obvious respect the gardeners showed as they followed her instructions. That evening, he confronted her in the drawing room, finding her sketching plans for the garden's restoration. "What exactly do you think you are doing with my mother's garden?" he demanded, his voice dangerously controlled. Eleanor set down her pencil and met his gaze squarely, refusing to be intimidated by his looming presence. "I am merely fulfilling my duties as Duchess," she replied calmly. "The gardens are part of the estate I am expected to manage, unless you prefer the house and grounds remain as cold and unwelcoming as its master." Sebastian's hand tightened on the back of the chair where it rested, the scar along his jaw whitening as his teeth clenched. "How dare you presume to understand anything about this house or its history? That garden was sacred to my mother. You have no right to disturb it." For 3 relentless days, rain pounded the Westmoreland estate, transforming the usually placid river that bordered the village into a raging torrent that burst its banks during the night, sending muddy water surging through the lower cottages where tenant farmers and estate workers lived with their families. Eleanor was awakened before dawn by a frantic pounding at her chamber door, where the head groom stood dripping on the carpet, his face grey with exhaustion. "The village is under water, Your Grace," he reported grimly. "Families are stranded on their rooftops, and the old mill bridge has washed away." Sebastian had departed for London 2 days earlier on business, leaving Eleanor as the only authority present. Without hesitation, she issued a series of clear commands, dispatching riders to neighbouring estates for assistance, ordering carriages to bring the displaced to safety, and instructing the kitchen staff to prepare food for the entire village, if necessary. By mid-morning, the great hall of Westmoreland House had been transformed into a relief centre, with makeshift beds arranged near the massive fireplaces, tables laden with bread and soup, and the household staff working alongside villagers who had escaped the waters with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Eleanor moved through the crowded space, her hair escaping its pins, her gown splashed with mud from her journey to the village to oversee rescue efforts, yet carrying herself with the quiet authority that had gradually won the respect of the household. She was kneeling beside an elderly man, helping him sip broth from a cup, when the great doors crashed open to reveal Sebastian, his travelling clothes immaculate despite the weather, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the scene before him. Without a word, he strode across the hall, seized Eleanor by the elbow, and marched her from the room into the library, slamming the door behind them with such force that the crystal chandelier trembled overhead. "You have turned my house into a charity ward without my permission," he snarled, rain dripping from his greatcoat onto the priceless Turkish carpet. "By what right do you invite the entire village to track mud through halls that have housed nobility for centuries?" Eleanor stood before him. Rain dampened and exhausted, strands of auburn hair plastered to her flushed cheeks, yet somehow appearing more regal than he despite his title. "Would you have them drown while awaiting your approval?" she fired back, amber eyes flashing with indignation. "These are your people, your grace, the families who work your land, maintain your estate, and depend upon your protection. They have nowhere else to go." Sebastian advanced on her, his tall frame looming as his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "My father would never have permitted such familiarity. The lower classes have their place, and it is not in the great hall of Westmoreland House." Their argument might have escalated further had the library door not creaked open to admit a small, bedraggled child of perhaps 4 years, her threadbare dress still damp from the flood, her thin arms clutching a sodden rag doll. She approached Eleanor without fear, wrapping herself around the Duchess's skirts and gazing up at Sebastian with wide, solemn eyes that held no recognition of his status, only assessment of whether he represented further danger to her world, already turned upside down. Eleanor placed a protective hand on the child's head, her expression softening as she looked down at the tiny figure. Sebastian stared at the child, something shifting in his cold grey eyes as he took in her vulnerable trust in Eleanor, the way her small fingers clutched at the silk of the Duchess's gown. For an instant, his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing not anger, but an echo of remembered pain, of a boy who had once sought similar comfort from his own mother, only to be turned away at his father's command. The fight seemed to drain from him visibly, his shoulders lowering a fraction as he stepped back. "See that the great hall is restored to order once the waters recede," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "In the meantime, Mrs. Winters will arrange for more blankets to be brought down." The days following the flood revealed a side of Sebastian that few at Westmoreland had witnessed in years. Having issued his grudging approval for the relief efforts, he might have retreated to his study and the mountain of correspondence awaiting his attention. Instead, to the astonishment of servants and villagers alike, the Duke remained in the great hall, his coat discarded, sleeves rolled up as he moved among the displaced families with unexpected purpose. When old Farmer Collins was carried in with a badly broken leg sustained while trying to save his livestock, Sebastian took command of the situation with the confidence of a seasoned physician. "Clear this table immediately," he ordered, sending footmen scrambling to obey. "I need clean linen, brandy, and my medical kit from the study." The entire hall watched in stunned silence as the Duke, notorious for his cold disdain, worked over the injured man with gentle, competent hands, setting the broken bone with practiced precision before splinting it securely. Eleanor, who had been organizing sleeping arrangements for the newest arrivals, paused to observe this transformation. In place of the cruel aristocrat who had terrorized his household, she saw a man whose touch was careful, whose instructions were clear but kind, whose focus on his patient was absolute. His scarred face, usually set in harsh lines of contempt, now showed only concentration and a strange tenderness as he murmured reassurances to the frightened farmer. "Where did you learn such skills?" Eleanor asked later that evening when they found themselves alone in the library, the temporary lull in emergency activity, allowing them a rare moment of respite. They sat before the fire, its warm glow softening the austere room as rain continued to batter the windows. Sebastian stared into the flames, cradling a glass of brandy in hands still reddened from hours of labor. "My time in the peninsula," he replied after a long pause. "I served as an officer during the war. When our regimental surgeon was killed at Salamanca, I took over his duties until a replacement could be found. I discovered I had an aptitude for it." Eleanor noted how he spoke of medical work with more animation than she had ever seen from him, his usual sardonic tone replaced by something approaching enthusiasm. "And yet you returned to assume your duties as Duke rather than pursuing medicine," she observed, careful to keep any judgment from her voice. His expression shuttered immediately. "My father summoned me home. The estate required an heir present, not a second son playing at surgeon on foreign soil." He took a long swallow of brandy, his jaw tightening. "My brother had died in my absence. Hunting accident." Eleanor heard the bitterness beneath the words, the weight of duty that had crushed whatever passion the young Sebastian might have harbored for healing rather than managing tenants and land. The silence stretched between them, surprisingly comfortable after days spent working alongside each other to address the crisis. "My father would have let them fend for themselves," Sebastian admitted finally, his voice so low Eleanor barely caught the words. "He would have considered it their punishment for building too close to the river. The weak must suffer the consequences of their poor choices," he used to say. "Then perhaps you are not your father after all," Eleanor responded softly, the firelight catching the amber flecks in her eyes as she regarded him. Sebastian looked up, meeting her gaze directly without his usual mask of cold indifference. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared understanding that neither was prepared to acknowledge aloud. The possibility that beneath his carefully constructed façade of cruelty lay a man capable of compassion, and that Eleanor might be the first person in years to recognize it. The realization clearly disturbed him. Sebastian set down his glass with sudden decision and rose to his feet. "The waters will begin receding tomorrow if the rain stops tonight," he said briskly, all trace of openness vanishing from his expression. "Make arrangements for the villagers to return home as soon as conditions allow. I have correspondence requiring my attention." Without waiting for her response, he strode from the room, the door closing firmly behind him as he fled not from Eleanor, but from the softening of his own carefully maintained barriers. The oppressive heat of late July descended upon Westmoreland House like a woolen blanket, turning the grand stone mansion into an oven despite servants' efforts to keep windows strategically open to catch any hint of breeze. Weeks had passed since the flood, and an uneasy truce had formed between Eleanor and Sebastian, their interactions marked by cautious civility rather than open hostility. The household had settled into a new rhythm under Eleanor's efficient management, while Sebastian divided his time between estate business and unexpected visits to the village, where he quietly continued treating minor ailments among the tenants. The arrival of an elegant travelling carriage on this sweltering afternoon shattered their fragile peace. Lady Victoria Huntington swept into the entrance hall uninvited, a vision in fashionable azure silk that complemented her raven curls and porcelain complexion. Tall, willowy, and possessed of the confident beauty that comes from a lifetime of admiration, she dispensed with formal greeting in favor of familiarity that bordered on impropriety. "Sebastian, darling," she exclaimed, extending gloved hands toward the Duke, who had emerged from his study at the commotion. "London is positively unbearable in this heat. I simply had to escape to the country, and naturally, Westmoreland was my first thought." Her smile revealed perfect teeth and precisely calculated warmth. "I do hope you can accommodate me for a few days." Eleanor, summoned by a wide-eyed housemaid, arrived to find Sebastian standing rigidly in the hall, his expression unreadable as Lady Victoria maintained her grip on his hands, her body positioned deliberately close to his. The tension between them was palpable, charged with a history Eleanor immediately sensed, but could not decipher. With perfect composure, Eleanor stepped forward, forcing Lady Victoria to acknowledge her presence and release Sebastian. Lady Victoria, she greeted her unexpected guest, with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "What an unexpected pleasure! I am Eleanor, Duchess of Westmoreland. I do not believe we have been introduced." The flicker of surprise in Lady Victoria's sapphire eyes confirmed that she had known perfectly well who Eleanor was, but had chosen to ignore her. The dinner that followed was an exercise in subtle warfare, with Lady Victoria deploying every weapon in her considerable arsenal to undermine Eleanor and remind Sebastian of their former intimacy. She referenced shared memories and mutual acquaintances with pointed frequency, her musical laugh punctuating stories clearly designed to exclude Eleanor from the conversation. The dining room, already uncomfortable in the summer heat, grew positively stifling with unspoken tension. It was over the dessert course that Lady Victoria finally made her most direct attack, leaning toward Eleanor with malicious sweetness dripping from her tone. "Your husband has quite specific tastes, my dear," she remarked, trailing one perfectly manicured finger around the rim of her wine glass. "In everything from wine to women. I expect you are still learning to navigate his particular preferences." The implication hung in the air, deliberately crafted to highlight Eleanor's presumed inexperience, in contrast to Victoria's intimate knowledge. Every eye at the table, including Sebastian's cousin Lord Thomas, who had joined them for dinner, fixed on Eleanor's face, awaiting her humiliation. Instead of the embarrassed flush or jealous response Lady Victoria clearly anticipated, Eleanor regarded her with the calm assessment of a chess player recognizing a predictable move. "How fortunate that tastes can evolve with maturity, Lady Victoria," she replied, her tone conversational yet carrying a subtle edge that silenced the entire table. "I find that what appealed to a younger man rarely satisfies the discernment he develops with age and wisdom." Sebastian, who had been watching this exchange with thinly veiled tension, nearly choked on his wine, raising his glass to his lips to hide the unexpected smile that threatened to break through his usually stern expression. Lord Thomas barked a surprised laugh that he quickly disguised as a cough, while Lady Victoria's perfect complexion flushed with anger at this unexpected parry from a woman she had clearly underestimated. The remainder of the meal passed in relative peace, Lady Victoria's arsenal temporarily depleted by Eleanor's composed response, though the calculating gleam in her eye promised further skirmishes to come. A summer thunderstorm descended upon Westmoreland with sudden violence, jagged lightning illuminating the night sky as thunder rattled the ancient windows in their frames. Eleanor lay awake in her bed, listening to the tempest rage outside, her mind as restless as the weather. The previous days had been tense following Lady Victoria's departure, with Sebastian retreating once more behind his wall of cold formality, as if their brief moments of connection during the flood had never occurred. Knowing sleep would continue to elude her, Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her nightdress and made her way through the darkened corridors toward the library, drawn by the thought of finding solace in a book. She hesitated at the partially open door, surprised to see flickering firelight spilling into the hall at this late hour. Pushing the door wider, she discovered Sebastian seated before the dying fire, a glass of brandy dangling from his fingers as he stared up at the portrait hanging above the mantel. In the unsteady light, his usually guarded expression was stripped bare, revealing a vulnerability that caught Eleanor's breath in her throat. The portrait that held his attention depicted a beautiful woman with Sebastian's grey eyes and proud bearing, though her expression held a gentleness entirely absent from her son's face. Even in painted form, the late Duchess seemed to radiate a fragility that spoke of suffering endured with quiet dignity. Eleanor must have made some small sound, for Sebastian turned suddenly, his unguarded expression instantly replaced by his customary mask of indifference. "I apologize for intruding, Your Grace," she said softly. "I could not sleep and thought to find a book. I shall leave you to your privacy." "Wait," Sebastian replied, the single word emerging with unexpected urgency. "The storm," he continued more composedly, gesturing to the window where rain lashed against the glass. "It unsettles the house. Old buildings like this have their voices." Eleanor moved hesitantly into the room, the intimacy of the hour and his uncharacteristic invitation creating a strange atmosphere between them. She glanced again at the portrait that had held his attention. "Your mother was beautiful," she observed quietly. Sebastian followed her gaze, his features softening almost imperceptibly. "She was everything gentle and good in this house," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "An accomplished musician, a gifted artist. Qualities my father considered useless compared to the production of an heir." He took another swallow of brandy, his eyes never leaving his mother's painted face. "She withered away before my eyes," he confessed. "Year by year, her spirit dimmed like a candle slowly being extinguished. I was 15 when she died, though in truth, she had been dying since the day she married my father. I swore then that I would never trap someone as she was trapped, forced into a union that slowly destroyed her." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, close enough to see the firelight reflected in his eyes, which shone with suspicious brightness. "Yet here we are," she said cautiously, both trapped by circumstance. "My father's debts, your duty to your title. The irony does not escape me." Sebastian turned to look at her directly, all pretense abandoned in this strange midnight hour that seemed to exist outside the normal rules governing their interactions. "I have been cruel to you," he acknowledged, his voice barely audible above the storm. "From our first meeting, I determined to keep you at a distance, to ensure you harbored no illusions about finding happiness in this marriage." Eleanor held his gaze, offering honesty in return. "I expected nothing from this union but security for my family," she admitted. "Happiness seemed an impossible luxury reserved for those fortunate enough to marry by choice. But perhaps, Sebastian, there is a middle path between romantic delusion and deliberate cruelty. Perhaps we might find, if not happiness, then at least respect in the life we must share." The fire popped and settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney as their words hung in the air between them. For the first time since their marriage, they regarded each other not as adversaries, but as fellow travelers on an unexpected journey, both wounded by the circumstances that had brought them together, both uncertain of the path forward. Sebastian set down his glass, the gesture deliberate, as if marking a decision. "I cannot promise more than I am capable of giving," he said finally, "but perhaps I might try to be less of my father's son." Eleanor nodded, understanding the enormity of what he offered. "And I shall expect nothing beyond what you freely choose to give," she responded. The thunder rolled again, closer now, yet somehow less threatening than before. The summer ball at Lord and Lady Harrington's country estate provided the neighbouring aristocracy with a welcome distraction from the season's unrelenting heat. Their ballroom, larger than fashion might dictate for a country house, glittered with hundreds of candles reflected in gilt mirrors that lined the walls, creating an illusion of endless light and movement as dancers whirled across the polished floor. Eleanor entered on Sebastian's arm, her appearance calculated to draw admiring glances in a gown of emerald silk that highlighted her auburn hair and fair complexion. For this public appearance, Sebastian played the attentive husband flawlessly, every inch the proud Duke introducing his bride to county society. Yet once the orchestra struck up the first dance, his demeanour shifted with calculated precision. He led Lady Harrington onto the floor for the opening quadrille, as protocol demanded. but then proceeded to dance with every eligible young lady present, conspicuously avoiding his own wife. Eleanor maintained her composure throughout this deliberate slight, engaging in pleasant conversation with various matrons and gentlemen, her smile fixed firmly in place, despite the curious glances and whispered comments that followed her like shadows. The town's gossip had evidently travelled beyond London, with speculation about the nature of their hasty marriage providing ample fodder for country curiosity. By the third set, even the most oblivious guests had noted the Duke's pointed avoidance of his Duchess, creating a buzz of speculation that grew with each dance. Eleanor sat beside an elderly countess, whose partial deafness made her an ideal companion for weathering such humiliation, as she remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Lady Victoria, who had somehow secured an invitation despite having no connection to the Harringtons, seized the opportunity to twist the knife. She glided to Eleanor's side during a brief pause between dances, her face a perfect mask of false sympathy. "He is making quite the statement about his new bride, is he not?" she murmured, watching as Sebastian led a blushing debutante onto the floor for a country dance. How distressing to be so publicly rejected after such a short time. "One wonders what you might have done to deserve such treatment." Eleanor felt rather than saw the attention their conversation attracted, aware that her response would be noted and repeated throughout the county by morning. With deliberate care, she arranged her features into a pleasantly neutral expression. "I find it charming that my husband takes his social obligations so seriously, Lady Victoria," she replied, her voice carrying just enough to reach nearby eavesdroppers. "The mark of true nobility is consideration for others, after all." As the orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz, Eleanor rose with sudden decision. The movement caught Sebastian's attention across the room, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her purposeful approach. He stood with his next intended partner, the young daughter of a baronet, who blushed furiously at his attention. Eleanor arrived just as he was about to lead the girl onto the floor. "Your Grace," she addressed him with perfect politeness, "I believe I must claim this dance. It would be remiss of me not to dance at least once with my husband, would it not?" The challenge in her eyes belied her pleasant tone. Sebastian found himself trapped by the very social conventions he had been exploiting, unable to refuse without creating a scene far more damaging than the subtle humiliation he had orchestrated. With a tight smile, he bowed to his disappointed partner and extended his hand to Eleanor. The ballroom watched with avid interest as the Duke led his Duchess onto the floor, speculation rippling through the crowd as they assumed their positions for the waltz. Sebastian's hand at her waist was properly placed yet entirely impersonal, his expression remote as they began to move with the music. "If we must endure this marriage," Eleanor whispered through her practiced smile, her eyes locked with his, "we will do so with dignity, both of us. I have tolerated your private coldness, Sebastian, but I will not accept public humiliation." She emphasized her point with a subtle pressure of her fingers against his shoulder. Sebastian stared down at her with an unreadable expression, the scar along his jaw whitening slightly as he clenched his teeth. "You presume much, Lady Westmoreland," he replied, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I presume nothing except the basic courtesy due my position," she countered smoothly, never missing a step as he guided her through a turn. "You made your point with Lady Victoria. Must you also make it with every country family from here to Hampshire?" Autumn painted the Westmoreland woods in brilliant hues of copper and gold, the ancient oaks and maples shedding their summer finery to carpet the forest floor with crisp leaves that crackled beneath Eleanor's mare's hooves. These solitary morning rides had become her sanctuary in recent weeks, a precious freedom in a life still largely constrained by duty and her husband's continuing aloofness. Since the Harrington ball, Sebastian had maintained a careful civility in public, but their private interactions remained strained, as if their midnight conversation in the library had never occurred. Eleanor urged her mare deeper into the woods, following a narrow path that wound through a particularly beautiful grove of beech trees, their leaves glowing like flames in the early morning sunlight. She had just rounded a bend when disaster struck without warning. A snake, disturbed from its rest among the fallen leaves, slithered suddenly across the path directly before her horse. The mare reared in terror, her front hooves pawing the air as Eleanor fought to maintain her seat. For a heart-stopping moment, she believed she had succeeded. But then the mare twisted violently, throwing her from the saddle with terrible force. Eleanor felt herself flying through the air, a curious moment of weightlessness before the ground rushed up to meet her with brutal impact. Her head struck something hard, and darkness claimed her consciousness instantly. Sebastian had risen before dawn, restlessness driving him to the solitude of the hunting fields rather than the suffocating silence of his study. With a rifle tucked beneath his arm and his hunting dog ranging ahead, he had been tracking a stag through the eastern woods when the sound of pounding hooves caught his attention. Rounding a copse of trees, he witnessed Eleanor's fall with horrifying clarity, too distant to intervene but close enough to see her body crumple lifelessly against the forest floor as her panicked mare bolted away through the trees. For a frozen moment, Sebastian stood paralyzed by the sight, then dropped his rifle without thought and ran toward her fallen form with a speed born of desperate fear. He reached her side, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he knelt beside her still figure, leaves and dirt smeared across her riding habit. Her auburn hair tumbled loose from its pins. "Eleanor," he called, his voice cracking as he carefully turned her to assess her injuries. A nasty gash at her temple welled with blood, but it was her complete stillness that sent ice through his veins. He pressed trembling fingers to her neck, nearly collapsing with relief when he detected the steady rhythm of her pulse. Without hesitation, Sebastian gathered Eleanor into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all, heedless of the blood that stained his hunting jacket. The 3-mile journey back to Westmoreland House passed in a blur of fear and determination, Sebastian refusing assistance when he encountered a groundskeeper who offered to run for help. Not trusting her safety to anyone else, he carried her the entire distance, his arms burning with exertion yet never loosening their protective hold. The household erupted into chaos when the Duke burst through the doors, with the unconscious Duchess in his arms, his face ashen beneath its usual tan, his voice cracking with strain as he shouted for the doctor to be summoned immediately. Servants who had never witnessed their master display any emotion beyond cold disdain stared in shock at the naked fear in his eyes as he carried Eleanor up the grand staircase to her chambers, refusing to relinquish her even to the capable hands of Mrs. Winters and her lady's maid. "He wants hot water, clean bandages, and my medical kit brought to the Duchess' chambers immediately," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument as he shouldered open her bedroom door. For hours, Sebastian remained at Eleanor's bedside, gently cleaning and bandaging her head wound, checking her pulse with anxious regularity, his usual impassive mask abandoned in the face of genuine terror for her well-being. When the local doctor finally arrived, Sebastian hovered at his shoulder, questioning each diagnosis and recommendation with the expertise gained during his military service. "He is quite frantic, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters whispered to the still unconscious Eleanor, as she adjusted the counterpane later that afternoon. "I have not seen him look at anyone with such concern since before his mother died." Throughout the evening and into the night, Sebastian maintained his vigil, dismissing suggestions that he rest or take sustenance, his grey eyes never leaving Eleanor's pale face. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, his tall frame slumping awkwardly in the chair drawn close to her bedside, his hand unconsciously seeking hers where it lay upon the coverlet. It was in this position that Eleanor found him when she finally woke in the pale light of early morning, her head throbbing painfully, but her heart oddly full at the sight of his sleeping face, the worry still evident in his furrowed brow, and the protective way his hand covered hers even in slumber. Autumn sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Eleanor's bedchamber, casting golden patterns across the counterpane and illuminating dust motes that danced in the warm air like tiny constellations. A week had passed since her accident, and though the throbbing in her head had subsided to a dull ache, the physician had insisted she remain abed for at least another fortnight to ensure proper healing. Eleanor had expected the enforced confinement to be unbearable, her days stretching endlessly with nothing but her thoughts for company. Instead, she had found herself with a most unexpected companion. Sebastian arrived each afternoon, his arms invariably laden with books selected from the library with surprising thoughtfulness. Today, he carried a volume bound in faded red leather that he placed carefully on the bedside table as he took his now customary seat in the chair beside her. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, his usual formality deepened by an unfamiliar hesitancy. "It is a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. My mother kept it hidden from my father, who considered such reading inappropriate for a duchess." Eleanor's eyes widened with genuine surprise as she reached for the book, her fingers tracing the worn spine with reverence. "I did not expect a duke to have read Mary Wollstonecraft," she admitted, opening the cover to find the previous duchess's name inscribed in elegant script on the flyleaf. Sebastian's expression shifted, the hint of a genuine smile transforming his usually stern features. "There are many things you do not know about me, Eleanor," he replied, using her given name for the first time since their marriage. His voice lingered over the syllables as if testing their sound. "Just as I am discovering there is far more to you than I initially allowed myself to perceive." The admission hung between them, tentative yet significant. Eleanor marked the small victory silently, sensing that to acknowledge it directly might cause him to retreat once more behind his walls of formality. Instead, she opened the book to a well-worn passage, the paper soft beneath her fingers. "Have you read it?" she asked, genuinely curious about the inner workings of his mind. Sebastian nodded, settling more comfortably into his chair. "My mother insisted upon it. She believed education should not be determined by gender, a radical notion that scandalized my tutors. She encouraged me to read widely, to question accepted wisdom rather than simply absorbing it without thought." The afternoon passed in surprisingly companionable discussion as they discovered shared passions for literature and philosophy, their conversation flowing with an ease neither had thought possible. Sebastian revealed a depth of reading and critical thought that would have shocked London society, which knew him only as the cold, forbidding duke who appeared at social functions out of duty rather than pleasure. Eleanor, in turn, found herself sharing her own intellectual interests without the self-censorship she had practiced throughout her life, knowing most men preferred feminine accomplishments to genuine erudition. As shadows lengthened across the floor, their conversation gradually shifted from literature to more personal matters. Sebastian gazed out the window at the autumn landscape, his profile outlined against the golden light. "I have treated you abominably from the moment of our first meeting," he said finally, his voice low and roughened with emotion. "I resented being forced to marry, resented the expectations of society and the demands of my position. My quarrel was never truly with you, Eleanor, yet you bore the brunt of my bitterness." Eleanor studied his face, seeing vulnerability beneath his usual mask of indifference. "We were both trapped by circumstances beyond our control," she replied gently. "Neither of us entered this marriage by choice." Sebastian turned to face her, his grey eyes meeting hers directly. "Yet you have conducted yourself with dignity and grace despite my deliberate cruelty. When I saw you fall from your horse," he continued, his voice faltering slightly, "I felt fear such as I have not known since my mother's final illness. The thought that you might die believing yourself despised was suddenly unbearable." Eleanor reached out impulsively, her hand covering his where it rested on the bed. "Perhaps we might begin anew," she suggested softly, not as adversaries forced together by duty, but as two people discovering each other without the burden of resentment. Sebastian looked down at their joined hands, his fingers slowly curling around hers in tentative acceptance of her offer. Winter descended upon Westmoreland with silent grace, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland of white that softened the harsh lines of the estate. Frost etched delicate patterns across the windows, while snow blanketed the formal gardens, creating a peaceful hush that seemed to extend even to the halls of the great house. As December progressed, a subtle but unmistakable change had taken root between Sebastian and Eleanor, their tentative truce evolving into something neither had anticipated. The Duke still maintained a certain reserve, decades of bitter experience not easily overcome, but the cruel edge had vanished from his words, replaced by a careful consideration that spoke volumes to those who knew him best. It was during breakfast one morning, with snow falling gently outside, that Eleanor broached the subject that had occupied her thoughts for days. "I believe we should host a Christmas gathering," she suggested, watching Sebastian's reaction carefully over the rim of her teacup. "Not a grand ball, but perhaps dinner and music for neighbours and a few close acquaintances. This house has been closed to celebration for too long." Sebastian looked up from his correspondence, surprise evident in his grey eyes. "Westmoreland has not hosted Christmas festivities since my mother was alive," he replied, his tone neutral rather than dismissive. "The servants would hardly know where to begin." "The servants would welcome the opportunity," Eleanor countered gently. "Mrs. Winters mentioned just yesterday how the house once came alive during the Christmas season. Besides," she added with a hint of challenge in her amber eyes, "surely the Duke of Westmoreland can afford a few extra candles and a roast goose." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head in a gesture that might almost have been interpreted as playful. "Very well, Duchess, but the responsibility for this revival falls entirely upon your shoulders. I warn you that my participation will extend only to appearing when required and refraining from frightening the guests with my notorious temperament." Eleanor accepted this concession with grace, already formulating plans as she finished her tea. In the days that followed, Westmoreland House underwent a transformation that extended beyond mere decoration. Under Eleanor's guidance, the staff attacked long-neglected corners with renewed vigor, polishing silver that had tarnished in storage, airing linens that smelled of lavender and thyme. Evergreen boughs appeared along the banisters, filling the air with the scent of pine, while red ribbons and holly berries added touches of color to rooms that had known only austerity for years. Most remarkably, the changes extended to Sebastian himself. Though he maintained his customary reserve, the household noted with cautious optimism that the Duke could occasionally be found observing the preparations with something approaching interest, offering unexpected suggestions about the placement of candles or which wines should be brought up from the cellar. On the night of the gathering, the great hall of Westmoreland stood transformed, its cold stone warmed by firelight and hundreds of candles that gleamed against evergreen boughs and crimson ribbons. Music filled the space for the first time in decades, a string quartet playing from the minstrel gallery, while guests moved through rooms that had been closed and shuttered for too long. The neighbors and local gentry who had accepted the invitation with surprised pleasure found themselves welcomed by a duke and duchess who presented a united front that defied the rumors of their strained alliance. Most astonishing to all who witnessed it was the sound of Sebastian Grenville's laugh, rich and genuine as he conversed with the local vicar about a theological point, the sound so unexpected that servants nearly dropped their trays in shock. Mrs. Winters, passing with a tray of mulled wine, whispered to a footman, his father would never believe his eyes. Later, as the evening drew to its close and the last guests departed into the snowy night, Eleanor found herself alone with Sebastian in the small antechamber adjacent to the great hall. A sprig of mistletoe hung above the doorway, placed there by some romantic servant with more optimism than discretion. Sebastian stood regarding her in the warm glow of candlelight, his customary mask of indifference nowhere in evidence as his eyes travelled over the deep green velvet of her gown, the soft curls that framed her face, the flush of success that coloured her cheeks. "You have brought life back to this house," he said finally, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. His hand rose hesitantly to touch her cheek, the gesture tentative, as if he feared she might pull away. "Perhaps to its master as well," Eleanor suggested softly, her heart quickening at his touch, at the unfamiliar warmth in his eyes that had once been so cold. Sebastian's gaze flickered to the mistletoe above them, then back to her face. "A tradition," he murmured, leaning closer with a question in his eyes. "One I find myself unexpectedly willing to honor." When Eleanor did not retreat, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that began as gentle exploration but quickly deepened with surprising passion. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as years of practiced coldness melted away in the heat of unexpected desire. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, startled by the intensity of feelings neither had anticipated when they entered their arranged marriage. Sebastian rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought to find this," he confessed. "Not in this house, not in this life." January brought renewed chill to Westmoreland, with frost etching silver patterns across window panes and snow transforming the formal gardens into an unbroken expanse of white. Yet within the great house, warmth had taken root, flowering in unexpected moments between Eleanor and Sebastian. Their relationship, begun in cold duty, had gradually transformed into something neither had anticipated, a tentative understanding built upon shared interests and growing respect. The servants noted with quiet satisfaction how the Duke sought out his wife's company rather than avoiding it, how his features softened when she entered a room, how their conversations over meals extended far beyond the necessary courtesies of their station. Even the household itself seemed to respond to this subtle thaw, the ancient stones somehow less forbidding as laughter occasionally echoed through corridors that had known only silence for decades. It was during this period of fragile happiness that Lord Thomas Grenville returned to Westmoreland from London, ostensibly to discuss estate matters with his cousin, but bringing with him the bitter envy that had festered since childhood. Thomas had long resented Sebastian's position, having grown up as the spare rather than the heir. Always in the shadow of his older cousin, despite what he considered his own superior charm and social graces. Finding Sebastian attentive to his wife, rather than mired in the cold isolation, Thomas had counted on to maintain his own influence over estate. Matters only intensified his resentment. Eleanor encountered Thomas in the drawing-room one evening as she sought a book she had left there earlier. Outside, snow fell in gentle flurries that muffled sound and created an illusion of peaceful isolation. Thomas stood warming himself before the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, and calculation in his eyes as he watched her enter. "Lady Westmoreland," he greeted her with exaggerated courtesy. "How delightful to find you alone. I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately." There was something in his tone that set Eleanor instantly on guard, though she maintained her composure as she moved to the bookshelf. "What did you wish to discuss, Lord Thomas?" His smile did not reach his eyes as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I merely wondered if my cousin has shared the full history of his relationship with Lady Victoria Huntington," he replied with careful nonchalance. Eleanor kept her expression neutral despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. "I see no reason why the Duke should discuss his past acquaintances with me," she answered, selecting her book with deliberate calm. Thomas moved closer, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Acquaintance is hardly the appropriate term, my dear cousin. They were engaged to be married, you see. Sebastian courted her quite ardently for months, even presented her with his mother's rings, only to break the engagement without explanation or apparent remorse. Left her utterly heartbroken. Poor Victoria never fully recovered from the humiliation." Eleanor felt an icy chill that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. The book in her hands suddenly seemed impossibly heavy as doubt crept back into her heart, poisoning the fragile trust she and Sebastian had begun to build. "The engagement was never announced publicly," Thomas continued, clearly savoring her distress. "My cousin has always excelled at keeping his cruelties private, disguising them as matters of honor or necessity. A useful talent for a man in his position, would you not agree?" Without waiting for her response, he drained his glass and moved toward the door. "I merely thought you should know the pattern, Lady Westmoreland, for your own protection." The winter evening felt suddenly colder as Eleanor stood alone in the drawing room, her mind racing with unwelcome images of Sebastian and Victoria together, of promises made and callously broken. The man Thomas described seemed all too familiar, the cold, cruel Duke who had mocked their wedding vows and deliberately humiliated her at public gatherings. Had the change in him been merely another performance, destined to end in similar heartbreak? Unable to remain within the confining walls of the house, Eleanor wrapped herself in a heavy cloak and slipped outside into the snow-covered garden, seeking clarity in the cold night air. She did not hear Sebastian approach until his voice cut through her troubled thoughts. "Thomas has been poisoning your mind against me," he stated flatly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he stood before her, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. I recognized the look on his face as he left the drawing room. Eleanor met his gaze directly, searching for truth in those grey eyes that had begun to warm when they looked upon her. "Is it poison if it is true?" she asked quietly. "Were you engaged to Lady Victoria?" Sebastian's expression hardened, the muscle in his scarred jaw tightening visibly. "Did Thomas tell you why the engagement ended? Or merely paint me as the villain in a story he has never fully understood?" Eleanor stood trembling in the snow-covered garden, the pristine white surrounding her like an accusation as she faced Sebastian across an emotional chasm that seemed to widen with each heartbeat. The intimacy they had cautiously built over recent months suddenly felt like a mirage, a cruel illusion created by a master of deception. Sebastian regarded her with eyes that held none of the coldness she had once known, yet the doubt Thomas had planted took root in fertile soil, still scarred by their difficult beginning. "You promised honesty," she reminded him, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I deserve the truth, not another carefully constructed tale designed to paint you in a favorable light." Sebastian remained motionless for several moments, snowflakes accumulating on his broad shoulders as he weighed her words. Without speaking, he finally extended his hand, not touching her, but offering connection. "This is not a conversation for the garden," he said quietly. "If you truly wish to know everything, let us at least discuss it where we will not freeze." Something in his tone, a resignation rather than defensiveness, convinced Eleanor to follow him inside. They retreated to their private sitting room, a space that had gradually become a sanctuary for them both, where they often spent evenings reading or engaging in the conversations that had built their fragile bridge of understanding. The fire cast dancing shadows across Sebastian's face as he stood with his back to the flames, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. "Victoria and I were never formally engaged," he began without preamble, though an understanding existed between us. "I believed myself in love, or at least as close to that emotion as my upbringing had permitted. I was prepared to offer marriage, had even retrieved my mother's rings from the family vault." His voice took on a hardened edge as he continued. "Then I discovered she was with child, Thomas's child." Eleanor sank into a chair, the revelation stealing her breath. "Thomas?" But he spoke as if she was the innocent party, devastated by your rejection. Sebastian laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. "Of course he did. Thomas has spent his life coveting what is mine, while shirking all responsibility for his own actions. Victoria came to me in desperation, hoping to pass the child off as mine by rushing our marriage. When I refused, she threatened scandal. I could have exposed her condition and its true paternity, ruining her completely in society. Instead, I accepted the role of villain. I broke our understanding without explanation, allowing speculation to fall solely upon my character. I have never told anyone the full truth," he admitted, his voice dropping as he stared into the fire, the flames casting shadows across his vulnerable expression. "I accepted being seen as the villain to protect her reputation and prevent the complete destruction of a woman I had once cared for, despite her deception." Eleanor watched him closely, seeing the years of accumulated bitterness and the toll that maintaining such a mask had taken. "Thomas benefits from the tale as well," she observed quietly. "He remains the charming, sympathetic cousin, while you bear the weight of society's judgment, his inheritance and position secured by your isolation." The muscle in Sebastian's jaw tightened. Thomas has always excelled at positioning himself advantageously, while others pay the price for his indiscretions. The child died before birth, and Victoria eventually married an elderly baron who either never knew or chose to overlook her past. I believed the matter concluded until she reappeared this summer, perhaps seeking to rekindle what never truly existed. Eleanor rose from her chair, crossing the distance between them with measured steps. She stopped before him, searching his face for any trace of deception, but finding only exhaustion and a fragile hope that she might believe him. "You have worn that mask so long you have forgotten it is not your true face," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "The cruel duke, the heartless aristocrat. These are roles you adopted first to protect others, then to protect yourself." Her fingers interlaced with his, warm against his cold skin. "I begin to see the man beneath the performance, Sebastian. He is worth knowing." Sebastian's expression shifted, surprise and tentative wonder replacing the guarded resignation as he tightened his grip on her hand. "I had forgotten who that man might be," he admitted roughly, "until you reminded me." Their eyes held in silent understanding, the connection between them deepening with shared truth rather than polite fiction. Sebastian moved closer, his free hand rising to touch her cheek with a gentleness that still surprised them both. The moment of reconciliation shattered as the door burst open without ceremony, Mrs. Winters appearing with uncharacteristic distress evident in every line of her usually composed face. "Your Grace," she addressed Eleanor breathlessly, "a messenger has just arrived from London. Your father has suffered an apoplexy. He is not expected to survive the night." The journey to London unfolded in a blur of anxiety and haste, Sebastian ordering his fastest team harnessed to the travelling carriage even as Eleanor hurriedly packed essentials for the journey. Within an hour of receiving the news, they were on the road, racing against time and the bitter January weather that threatened to delay them with each passing mile. Snow blanketed the countryside, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes beneath the pewter sky as their carriage hurtled southward, stopping only to change horses at posting houses, where Sebastian's ducal authority secured them the finest teams without delay. Throughout the grueling journey, Sebastian remained at Eleanor's side, his presence a steady anchor as she alternated between silent dread and feverish hope that they might reach her father in time. When her composure finally crumbled in the darkest hours of night, he drew her against his chest without hesitation, allowing her tears to soak his waistcoat as he murmured reassurances too low for the coachman to overhear. London greeted them with smoke-laden fog and freezing rain that seemed to penetrate their heaviest garments as the carriage finally pulled up before the Monroe townhouse shortly after dawn. The somber expressions of the servants who admitted them confirmed Eleanor's worst fears, yet the butler offered a spark of hope as he led them upstairs. "The Earl still lives, Your Grace, though the physician holds little expectation of recovery. He has been asking for you." Lord Monroe lay propped against pillows in his bedchamber, his once robust frame shockingly diminished, his skin holding the waxy pallor that often presaged death. His right side appeared frozen, the features of his face dragged downward as if by invisible weights. Yet his eyes brightened with recognition when Eleanor rushed to his bedside. "Eleanor, my girl," he managed, the words slurred but comprehensible. "You came." His functioning hand reached for hers with surprising strength. "And Westmoreland with you." "Good." Sebastian stepped forward at the mention of his title, maintaining a respectful distance while remaining close enough to support Eleanor should she need him. "I would speak with my daughter alone, if you would grant us a moment," Lord Monroe requested, his gaze fixed on the Duke with unexpected clarity. Sebastian bowed formally, though his eyes sought Eleanor's first, departing only when she nodded her assent down. When the door closed behind him, the Earl turned his focus fully upon his daughter, his breathing labored but his determination evident. "I have been a poor father, Eleanor," he confessed, each word clearly costing him precious energy. "I arranged your marriage for financial security, yes, but not only that. I saw something in Westmoreland, something familiar. The man I might have been before life hardened me." Eleanor stroked her father's hand, tears threatening as she witnessed his struggle to communicate these final thoughts. His mother dying when he was young, his cold father, the constant weight of expectations. The Earl paused, gathering strength. "I knew he needed someone to believe in him, as your mother once believed in me, before disappointment and resentment poisoned what we had. You have her strength, Eleanor. Her capacity to see beyond the surface. Forgive an old man's manipulation, but I believed you might save him from becoming his father, as I wish someone had saved me from becoming mine." The confession stunned Eleanor into momentary silence, her perception of her father shifting even as his life ebbed away. Before she could respond, he continued, his voice growing fainter. "The change in him today, the way he looks at you now, different from the day you wed. Tell me true, daughter. Has there been healing between you?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Yes, father," she whispered finally. "We have found our way to understanding, perhaps even to happiness." The Earl's eyes closed briefly, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Then my final act as your father was not entirely selfish. Perhaps there is hope for my soul, after all." He did not speak again, though he lived through the night and into the following day, Eleanor and Sebastian taking turns at his bedside until the final moment came with the setting sun. Lord William Monroe, Earl of Blackwood, passed from this world holding his daughter's hand, a peace on his face that had been absent for decades. The funeral held 3 days later at St. George's brought together London society despite the bitter weather. Curiosity about the notoriously reclusive Duke of Westmoreland's appearance, alongside his wife, drawing many who might otherwise have sent only formal condolences. Throughout the sombre service, Sebastian remained at Eleanor's side, his tall figure protective beside her black-clad form, his hand occasionally covering hers in full view of the assembled mourners. When she swayed slightly during the final prayer, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, his arm slipped around her waist to steady her, the intimate gesture causing a wave of whispers to ripple through the congregation. Society matrons exchanged glances of astonishment behind black-edged handkerchiefs, while gentlemen raised speculative eyebrows at this public display from a man known for his coldness. "I never thought to see the day," Lady Sheffield murmured to her companion, as they observed Sebastian guiding Eleanor into the waiting carriage after the service, his attention entirely focused on his wife's comfort rather than the curious onlookers. Westmoreland actually appears to care for her. Almost tender, if one can imagine such a thing from that quarter. "The transformation is quite remarkable," Lady Harrington agreed, studying the couple with shrewd assessment. "The once cruel Duke seems to have discovered his heart, and in the most unexpected place. Marriage to the Blackwood girl was meant to be his punishment for refusing more suitable matches all these years, yet observe how he looks at her now." London society would continue to speculate about this apparent miracle as the Duke and Duchess departed for Westmoreland the following day, leaving behind a city buzzing with theories about how the notorious Sebastian Grenville had apparently been tamed by the unremarkable daughter of a financially ruined earl. Spring returned to London with its characteristic unpredictability, warm sunshine alternating with sudden showers that left the streets gleaming and the air fresh with the scent of new beginnings. For Sebastian and Eleanor, who had remained in town to settle the Earl's affairs, the season brought not only renewal to the natural world, but a deepening of the bond that had grown between them through shared grief and understanding. The Westmoreland townhouse, long maintained as a cold, impersonal space for Sebastian's infrequent visits to the capital, had gradually transformed under Eleanor's influence. Rooms shuttered for years stood open to sunlight. Fresh flowers appeared on tables, and the staff moved with a relaxed efficiency that reflected the changed atmosphere between their master and mistress. Society had noted this transformation with avid interest, the apparent domestication of the notorious Duke providing ample fodder for drawing-room speculation. Most observers attributed the change to Eleanor's presumed condition, though no announcement had been made regarding an expected heir. In truth, Sebastian and Eleanor had simply discovered in each other what neither had dared hope for when their arrangement began, a partnership built on growing trust and genuine affection rather than mere duty or convenience. It was into this hard-won peace that Lady Victoria and Lord Thomas launched their final assault, motivated by jealousy that had festered into malice. Their campaign began with whispers at select gatherings, carefully planted suggestions that the Duke's marriage had been motivated by financial calculation rather than family obligation. The Blackwood estates, they intimated, contained undisclosed assets that only Sebastian, with his keen business acumen, had recognized. By the time Sebastian became aware of these rumors, they had evolved into more direct accusations. Forged letters began circulating among certain circles, purporting to reveal the Duke's cold-blooded strategy to acquire hidden Blackwood properties through marriage to the unsuspecting Eleanor. These fabrications reached their target when Lady Victoria arranged to encounter Eleanor at a modiste's shop frequented by society ladies. "My dear Duchess," she greeted Eleanor with false sympathy dripping from every syllable. "How distressing these revelations must be for you. To discover your husband married you not for your family name, nor even for your modest charms, but for properties he believed hidden in the Blackwood holdings." Eleanor maintained her composure despite the curious glances from other patrons. What revelations might those be, Lady Victoria? She inquired coolly, her spine straightening as she recognized the calculated attack. Lady Victoria produced a folded paper from her reticule, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. This letter from your husband to his solicitor, written shortly before your engagement, details his strategy quite explicitly. Such a shame that true affection is so rarely the foundation of aristocratic marriages. Would you not agree? The confrontation Sebastian had been anticipating finally erupted that evening in his London study, when Lord Thomas arrived unannounced, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, but clearly intent on delivering the coup de grace to the marriage he had long resented. Eleanor had retreated to the drawing-room after dinner, the forged letter Lady Victoria had pressed upon her burning in her pocket like a venomous creature waiting to strike. Sebastian and Thomas had barely begun their discussion when the door opened to admit Eleanor, her face pale but determined as she approached the massive desk where the men sat. "I believe we should address this directly, Your Grace," she said, placing the letter before Sebastian with steady hands. "Lady Victoria was kind enough to share it with me this afternoon." Sebastian glanced at the document, his expression darkening as he recognized the elaborate forgery bearing his supposed signature. "I wondered when this would surface," he remarked with dangerous calm, raising his eyes to Thomas, whose smug expression faltered slightly under that direct gaze. Thomas recovered quickly, rising to stand beside Eleanor with an air of protective concern that rang false to both his listeners. "My dear cousin, can you deny the contents? The timing aligns perfectly with your sudden interest in marriage after years of resistance. Eleanor deserves to know the truth of your calculations." Sebastian remained seated, his gaze never leaving Thomas as he addressed Eleanor. "This letter is a forgery, as Victoria and Thomas are well aware. The Blackwood estates never contained hidden assets. Your father's financial difficulties were painfully real and thoroughly documented." Thomas laughed, a hollow sound devoid of genuine amusement. "She will never truly trust you, Sebastian," he declared with sudden venom. "You have played the villain too convincingly for too long. The façade of reform may fool society, but a woman betrayed sees more clearly." Sebastian finally rose, his tall figure imposing in the lamplight that cast dramatic shadows across his scarred face. Yet instead of responding to Thomas with the cold anger everyone expected, he turned to Eleanor, his expression unguarded in a way she had seen only in their most private moments. "I have given you every reason to doubt me from the day we met," he acknowledged quietly. "My cruelty, my deliberate distance, my public humiliation of you, all justified in my mind as self-protection from an unwanted union. Yet you saw something worth saving beneath that performance, something I had forgotten existed. The choice is yours, Eleanor. Believe them and their fabricated evidence, or believe in what we have built together these past months." The study fell silent save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Thomas watched with barely concealed satisfaction, certain of his victory after years of careful manipulation. Eleanor looked between the two men, the forged letter, and finally back to Sebastian. Without hesitation, she moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his with deliberate purpose. "I believed in Sebastian when he showed me nothing but coldness," she stated clearly, her amber eyes steady as she faced Thomas. "How much more do I believe in him, now that he has shown me his true heart? I trust the man I have come to know, Lord Thomas, not the villain others have created to serve their own purposes." Westmoreland estate bloomed in glorious spring sunshine, the formal gardens exploding with colour as if nature itself celebrated the transformation that had occurred within the ancient stone walls. 1 year after Eleanor had first crossed the threshold as an unwanted bride, the grand house stood renewed, its windows gleaming, its halls filled with light and occasional laughter that still startled older servants who remembered decades of grim silence. Today the grounds bustled with activity as final preparations were completed for the garden party celebrating the Duke and Duchess's first anniversary, an event that had drawn curious acceptance from county families, still marveling at Sebastian Grenville's metamorphosis from cold tyrant to devoted husband. Gardeners made last-minute adjustments to flower arrangements, while footmen in Westmoreland livery arranged tables beneath white canopies that billowed gently in the spring breeze. The transformation of the estate mirrored the change in its master, whose stern countenance now softened whenever his gaze fell upon Eleanor, her slender figure now gracefully rounded with the child expected to arrive by midsummer. Westmoreland had not hosted such a gathering in a generation, not since the previous Duchess had been alive. Yet Eleanor had orchestrated the revival with confident ease, her natural warmth drawing willing cooperation from staff who had once moved through their duties in fearful silence. By mid-afternoon, the lawns filled with guests in spring finery, ladies in pastel silks shaded by parasols as they strolled paths bordered by blooming flowers, gentlemen in morning coats discussing crops and parliament, while servants circulated with champagne and delicate refreshments. Sebastian moved among them with surprising grace, his usual reserve tempered by genuine courtesy that shocked those who knew only his former coldness. The scar along his jaw seemed less prominent somehow, softened perhaps by the occasional smile that now appeared when Eleanor approached, or when conversation turned to the impending arrival of the Westmoreland heir. Lady Sheffield observed the Duke carefully from beneath her lace-trimmed bonnet, nudging her companion as Sebastian crossed the lawn to bring Eleanor a cup of lemonade, his solicitous attention to her comfort, evident even from a distance. "Astonishing," she murmured to Lady Harrington. "If I had not witnessed it myself, I would never have believed Westmoreland capable of such transformation." "Indeed," Lady Harrington agreed, adjusting her shawl against the spring breeze. "The change reminds me of those fairy tales where a curse is lifted by true love. Though I would never have cast Miss Blackwood as the enchantress capable of such magic. She has accomplished what all the diamond debutantes of a decade failed to achieve, melting the ice that encased his heart." As the afternoon progressed, Sebastian found himself constantly aware of Eleanor's location, his eyes seeking her out even when engaged in conversation with others. Eventually, he excused himself from a discussion with neighboring landowners to join her beside the newly restored rose garden, the project that had first ignited her defiance of his authority and inadvertently began the thawing of his heart. The roses were just beginning to bud, their promise of beauty visible in tightly furled petals that would soon burst into glorious color, much like the unexpected happiness that had blossomed between them. Eleanor turned at his approach, her face illuminated with pleasure that still humbled him each time he witnessed it. She wore a gown of soft lavender silk that complemented her auburn hair and accommodated her changing figure with elegant simplicity. "You have created a miracle here," Sebastian said, gesturing to the successful gathering spread before them. "My mother would be proud to see Westmoreland brought back to life." "Your doing, not mine," Eleanor replied, her gloved hand finding his in a gesture that had become natural between them. In the relative privacy afforded by a strategic arrangement of rose trellises, Sebastian drew her gently into his arms, one hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly where their child grew, tangible proof of the love that had developed against all expectations. "You shattered more than my pride, Eleanor," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion that he no longer attempted to disguise when they were alone. "You broke through every wall I built, every barrier I constructed to protect myself from feeling anything after watching my mother wither beneath my father's cruelty." Eleanor smiled up at him, her amber eyes filled with the understanding that had first recognized the man behind his carefully constructed façade of indifference. and found the heart everyone else had given up searching for," she added softly, her hand rising to touch his cheek, where the scar had once seemed such a fitting symbol of his emotional wounds. "That heart now beats for you, for our child, for the future I never dared imagine possible," Sebastian murmured, lowering his head to kiss her with tender passion that still surprised them both in its intensity. Neither noticed Mrs. Winters pausing at the edge of the garden with fresh tea for the refreshment table, the elderly housekeeper smiling with quiet satisfaction at the sight of the Duke and Duchess wrapped in each other's arms. "The curse is broken at last," she whispered to a young maid who had joined the household after the changes had already begun. "Westmoreland breathes again, as it was always meant to do." Overhead, swallows darted through the perfect blue sky, their joyful flight a celebration of spring and renewal as the ancient estate basked in sunshine, its master and mistress having finally discovered that love could indeed grow in the most unlikely soil, transforming both the house and its inhabitants with the patient power of belief in possibilities others had long ago abandoned.